Welcome to Lucid Dreams. I hope you like this podcast. I wake up in the morning with vague dreamlike impressions of being at a Michael Raduga seminar. I use the bathroom and review the Elijah Project assignment of counting in phase before returning to bed to fall asleep with the intention of catching a natural awakening. Waking up without movement, I roll out of bed to stand in a dim, poorly lit bedroom. Realism, 35%. Vision is blurry and the brightest light source seems to be coming from where the balcony door should be. I rub my hands vigorously, feeling an emerging friction and warmth, until I see them with great clarity before I begin to count aloud. I walk around the bed, noticing that the lampshade on the bedside table radiates a faint orange light. The object looks very much like it does in the real world, and touching it feels like I would expect it to feel. Realism, 100%. As I move towards the curtains and a partially visible balcony door, I become aware of the muffled sound of my voice and try to raise it as I count. I cross the curtains with some resistance and jump off the balcony. I seem to be on Main Street, in a vibrant alternative neighborhood that gives me the impression of being a virtual amalgam of where I currently live and where I used to live when I was a prepubescent girl. I'm feeling a bit nostalgic. The sky is defined by a pink sunrise with a beautiful, surreal blend of orange and blue strokes, an exceptional sight that can hardly be captured in words. I think I had been counting a little faster than the speed of seconds since the beginning of this experience, so at this point I slow down a bit but continue numerically towards 30 while rubbing my hands together as a background sensation. I look back to see where my house should be, and what I see is a much more simplistic structure that is radically different than what would be found in the real world. Contrary to the architecture in waking life, I feel exhilarated to be in a deep phase, surrounded by a colorful and realistic city under a strong twilight. I start running down the main road, with a tendency to speed up my counting exercise, sometimes feeling like a child who wants to reach the highest number before I finish, only to remind myself not to get too excited. The surroundings gradually become more picturesque and less urban, making me want to take flight. I glide over rooftops and treetops with ease, continuing the count as I head towards a horizon defined by a much brighter blue sky and the hint of a shimmering sea. I land on a grassy knoll next to a pebble beach and contemplate the gentle waves of the sea lapping against the shallow shore. As I run down the knoll to reach the water, I realize I'm on a collision course with a barbed wire fence, but I continue toward it, releasing numbers even harder once my body hits the wires to meet some resistance. I stubbornly persevere, stretching the fence like a bunch of rubber bands until it finally gives way as it runs through me. Having reached shallow water, I hear myself splash to a deeper end. I feel wet but not cold, that's okay, and as the refreshing waves hit my chest, I extend my arms and deliberately levitate about 30 meters above sea level and then perform a massive dive. As I rise into the air, I count the seconds slower than normal and try to adjust to something more realistic temporarily, but it's hard to determine the right pace. Stretching the fence like a bunch of rubber bands until it finally gives way as it goes through me. Having reached shallow water, I hear myself splash down to a deeper finish. I feel wet but not cold, that's okay, and as the refreshing waves hit my chest, I extend my arms and deliberately levitate about 30 meters above sea level and then perform a massive dive. As I rise into the air, I count the seconds slower than normal and try to adjust to something more realistic temporarily, but it's hard to determine the right pace. Stretching the fence like a bunch of rubber bands until it finally gives way as it passes through me. Having reached shallow water, I hear myself splashing to a deeper end. I feel wet but not cold, that's okay, and as the refreshing waves hit my chest, I extend my arms and deliberately levitate about 30 meters above sea level and then perform a massive dive. As I rise into the air, I count the seconds slower than normal and try to adjust to something more realistic temporarily, but it's hard to determine the right pace. I extend my arms and deliberately levitate about 30 meters above sea level and then perform a massive dive. As I rise into the air, I count the seconds slower than normal and try to adjust to something more realistic temporarily, but it is difficult to determine the correct pace. I extend my arms and deliberately levitate about 30 meters above sea level and then perform a massive dive. As I rise into the air, I count the seconds slower than normal and try to adjust to something more realistic temporarily, but it is difficult to determine the correct pace. The dive back to the sea temporarily interrupts the counting, but I calmly resume as I experience turbulence underwater. I surface to undulate like a dolphin between sea and air as the approaching waves grow larger and more challenging. The sea seems to partially bend to my will as the waterspouts surround me for a few seconds before giving way to the desired chaos. The countdown is undoubtedly delayed as I dance jubilantly with an environment completely dominated by turbulent seawater. Once again, I take flight into a calm blue sky, increasing the speed of the count, and descend into shallower water, where I begin to splash towards the beach, occasionally using my hands to pick up pebbles and shells from the ground beneath the shorts, which come close. The sea waves. These marine objects feel really solid to the touch, as well as glistening in the sunlight. I leave them all in the water before I reach dry land. Looking inland, I see people milling around in pale buildings that resemble a square garden on a college campus, piquing my interest and sexual desire. I am briefly sidetracked by the idea of having sex with a female character in the phase, which causes a considerable interval of measurable count for a few seconds, so the move to the garden square occurs and I run to a nearby canteen looking for a single woman. In the midst of apparently male students, I catch myself and resume counting as I exit the canteen to access other rooms within the building. I'm about to hit 80, possibly counting faster than I should, as I run down a hallway displaying rows of identical doors on either side, eagerly awaiting to meet the opposite sex. Ahead of me, a door opens and a seductive intellectual woman appears, holding a dark folder. She has shoulder-length straight brown hair and hazel eyes behind dark-rimmed glasses. She wears a cream-colored vest and a knee-length skirt. Her silky white blouse is partially unbuttoned and her tall figure somehow implies that she is wearing high heels. She looks like a teacher to me, too. We immediately embrace and begin to tear our clothes off our bodies to have erect, penetrative sex. The sensations of having sex feel absolutely real and the rhythm of intercourse helps me slow down the count to something closer, I think, to actual seconds, as I release the numbers in loud moans of pleasure, the only way I could keep counting during this emotionally charged episode. I reach orgasm and end up pushing the astonished character to the ground before covering her with large amounts of cum, counting the last few seconds with each eruption as I stimulate an incredibly large phallus in slow motion. The mood fades and I wake up in bed thinking 90. I reach orgasm and end up pushing the astonished character to the floor before covering her with large amounts of cum, counting the last seconds with each eruption as I stimulate an incredibly large phallus in slow motion. The mood fades and I wake up in bed thinking 90. I reach orgasm and end up pushing the astonished character to the floor before covering her with large amounts of cum, counting the last seconds with each eruption as I stimulate an incredibly large phallus in slow motion. The mood fades and I wake up in bed thinking 90. The experience, which fortunately seemed to last a long time, but I am confused by the fact that I only counted 90 seconds, when the phase lasted over 3.5 minutes according to the stopwatch. If it were possible to take an actual clock to phase, the number of seconds I would have accurately recorded would have been 215. I understand that most of the time was probably off in the second count, and there was a considerable gap during the experiment, but never expected it to drop by about 125. However, it did seem to help maintain the phase state. Apologies for the explicitly graphic description towards the end.
This podcast is over. See you in the next one. If you want us to share your experience in a podcast, write us to the email you will find in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell so you don't miss any new video. See you next time.